The courtroom was colder than it needed to be, the kind of manufactured chill that seemed designed to discourage emotion. Lillian Stone sat with her spine straight, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her pearl earrings catching the fluorescent light with every subtle turn of her head. Her lawyer, Cynthia Morales, had warned her about theatrics, the raised voices, the pointed fingers, the strategies designed to rattle. But Lillian had been a businesswoman for 37 years. She had negotiated leases in downtown Charleston before the boutiques moved in, bought property during the recession, and sold it just before the market swung back. She knew how to wait out a storm. Across the aisle, Jason and Danielle Holbrook whispered furiously to their legal team. The siblings barely looked alike. Jason's jaw was clenched tight beneath his expensive shave, while Danielle seemed almost theatrical in her grief, clutching tissues with unnecessary flair. They hadn't spoken to their father in over a decade. Yet here they were, sleeves rolled and sharpened for battle, accusing the woman who had been by his side during his last 5 years of life. Judge Bernard Atkins adjusted his glasses as he reviewed the initial complaint. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, with a manner that suggested he had long since lost patience for nuance. His courtroom was his stage, and today, the script suited his taste for irony. So let me get this straight, he said, glancing from the plaintiff's table to Lillian. You're telling me this woman, who married your father 5 years ago, is now claiming ownership of nearly everything he had? Jason's attorney, a sharp-nosed man named Harlan Keene, rose smoothly. Not claiming, Your Honor. Seizing. Through marriage. A house, multiple vehicles, stocks, an oceanfront rental, and a trust account. All with little documentation to support her claim of prior ownership. Judge Atkins tilted his head, amused. Right. And your position is that this marriage, despite being legally valid, was little more than a scheme to inherit his assets. Danielle's voice rang out before her lawyer could stop her. She was a gold digger, Your Honor. She took advantage of a lonely old man. We weren't there, and she knew it. The courtroom went still. Lillian didn't blink. She didn't glance at the siblings or flinch at the term. She simply nodded once toward Cynthia, who opened her leather folder and removed a large manila envelope. I have documents, Your Honor, Cynthia said clearly. Deeds, investment portfolios, tax returns, all under Ms. Stone's name prior to her marriage to Mr. Holbrook. They include the property at 14 Wentworth Street, a rental unit in Folly Beach, and a portfolio with Vanguard, opened in 1996. The joint account with Mr. Holbrook was never used for any of these purchases. Judge Atkins raised an eyebrow. You're saying she already owned the assets? Every one, Cynthia replied. She brought them into the marriage. Lillian slid the envelope across the polished wood. Her hands were steady. Not out of arrogance, but out of habit, the way someone holds a presentation in a boardroom or hands over a document at closing. Facts, she had learned, often speak louder than outrage. Keene reached for the envelope, but the judge gestured to his bailiff, who brought it directly to the bench. Silence fell as he opened it. The only sound was the crackle of paper and the occasional turn of a page. Lillian's breathing stayed slow, methodical. She remembered the first time she met Walter Holbrook. It had been at a fundraiser for the College of Charleston, where she was chairing the donor committee. He had been newly retired, wearing a seersucker jacket and smiling like someone who'd recently laid down a burden. He asked intelligent questions about community development, not her portfolio. They spoke for 20 minutes. He hadn't even asked for her number that night. They were married 17 months later. She was never after his money, Cynthia had told her quietly, back when the first threat of legal action came. But that's the story they'll tell. Judge Atkins leaned back in his chair now, the folder still open in front of him. The shift in his expression was subtle, not a full change, but the edge of his posture softened. He looked back down at the papers, then at Lillian. These are notarized, he said slowly. Some of these go back over 20 years. Keene cleared his throat. Even so, Your Honor, we believe there may have been a transfer of. Judge Atkins raised a hand. Counselor, I'm going to need time to review all of this. But let me be clear, if this documentation holds, your argument weakens considerably. Jason's jaw twitched. Danielle looked stunned, her mouth slightly open. The judge turned to Lillian for the first time directly. Miss Stone, do you have any comment? She met his eyes calmly. Only this, Your Honor. I did not come into Mr. Holbrook's life empty-handed. I was not looking to gain, only to share. She didn't add that she'd loved Walter. That he'd been kind, attentive, and flawed. That they'd fought over music volume and toothpaste caps and who left the porch light on. That he'd cried when her dog died. That he'd insisted on joint yoga classes even though his knees cracked like glass. No one in that courtroom wanted to hear about the man behind the trust fund. So she said nothing more. The judge nodded. Very well. We'll recess until Monday. I expect a full review of these documents by then. As the gavel fell, the courtroom buzzed into motion again, lawyers gathering folders, siblings whispering in new urgency, the bailiff gesturing. Toward the hallway Lillian stood slowly, smoothing her gray wool skirt. She didn't look at the Halbrooks as she walked past. She didn't need to, the truth was already in the envelope, and it was only the beginning. Charleston in late March was a contradiction, soft breezes and jasmine in bloom, but with that stubborn chill that clung to the shadows like a memory. Lillian sat alone at her usual cafe on King Street, a narrow place tucked between an antique shop and a law office. The server, a college student with tired eyes, brought her black coffee without asking. She knew Lillian's order by heart. There was comfort in patterns. In being known, not for who you married, but for who you'd always been. She stared out the window, past the old brick facades and the slow foot traffic. Somewhere behind her reflection in the glass, she could see herself, younger, firmer, full of the kind of anger that once kept her alive. But time had turned her anger into discipline. She didn't rush. She didn't break. She endured. The door chimed. Cynthia slid into the seat across from her, dropping her bag and folding her blazer back with practiced ease. "You okay?" she asked. Lillian nodded. They looked surprised. Cynthia smirked. They were. Honestly, I think the judge was too. "I don't blame them," Lillian said, sipping her coffee. "Women like me aren't supposed to show up prepared. We're supposed to apologize for existing." Cynthia didn't argue. She'd seen the same pattern, again and again, underestimated women, quietly bulldozed unless they came armed with files and grit. She leaned forward. "I've started digging into the Halbrooks' financial background," she said. "The children, Jason and Danielle, they're leveraged up to their ears. Credit lines, second mortgages, investment missteps. If they thought Walter left them something big, they probably needed it." Lillian's expression didn't change, but a cold weight settled into her chest. She had suspected, of course, that their sudden interest in the estate wasn't grief, but desperation. Still, hearing it said aloud made her feel like she was standing too close to a fire. "I never asked Walter to cut them off," she said quietly. "He did that before I met him." "I know," Cynthia replied. "And I think the court will believe it too, especially once we get those letters admitted." Lillian hesitated. "You think we should use them? They're handwritten. Dated. Painfully clear. If Jason wants to portray himself as a dutiful son, the judge should know the truth." Lillian's fingers tightened slightly around her mug. She remembered those letters, the ones Walter wrote and never sent. The apologies, the anger, the hurt over missed birthdays and cold Thanksgivings. She'd found them tucked in a manila folder behind tax records. When she asked him about them, he'd just said, "Some things are easier to write than to fix." She'd offered to help him mail them. He never did. Cynthia watched her carefully. "I won't submit them unless you say so." Lillian looked back out the window. The light had shifted. The streets were still slow, but she could see the world beginning to bloom again, people shedding jackets, lingering in conversation. It made her chest ache with a strange kind of longing. "I don't want to humiliate them," she said. "But I won't let them lie, either." Cynthia nodded once. "We'll do it clean. Nothing personal. Just facts." They sat in silence for a moment, the way people do when something big is moving underneath but neither wants to be the first to name it. Finally, Cynthia stood. "I'll get the next filings ready. Monday's going to be intense." "They'll come harder." Lillian gave a slight smile. "Let them." That evening, Lillian walked alone through the quiet streets of South of Broad. The houses here were older than memory, with ivy-covered walls and wrought iron gates that whispered secrets. In the dark, she paused outside a house that wasn't hers, a pale yellow one with green shutters, and stared for a moment. She had once lived there, nearly 30 years ago, with her first husband. The man who taught her about smallness. About what it meant to shrink so someone else could feel big. She left him when she was 35, with no plan and only $1,200 in her name. She'd started again with a leased storefront on Rutledge Avenue, selling locally made home goods, sleeping in the office for 6 months. By the time she met Walter, she'd owned 4 properties, employed 11 people, and had more retirement savings than most people earned in a lifetime. He'd asked her, once, what she wanted from life. She'd said, peace. Now she wondered if peace always came with a fight. Back home, Lillian fed her cat, took off her shoes, and slipped out of her wool skirt like it was armor. The house was quiet, filled with the soft tick of clocks and the faint scent of cedar from the furniture she'd polished that morning. The television stayed off. She didn't want distraction. She wanted clarity. On her kitchen table, she laid out the stack of letters again, the ones Walter had written to his children. She read through the first, then the second. By the 5th, her eyes began to blur. Not from tears, but from the exhausting weight of someone else's regrets. She had lived her life preparing for storms, emotional, financial, legal. But nothing could prepare her for the Loneliness that came from defending a man who could no longer speak for himself. When the phone buzzed with a text from Cynthia, they've filed for an emergency hearing. Friday. She exhaled slowly, as if absorbing a blow without flinching. Of course they had, the war hadn't even started yet. The first time Walter Holbrook asked Lillian to dinner, he was so nervous that he spilled water across the table. Not wine, not anything dramatic, just a half glass of ice water that rushed toward her linen napkin like a clumsy wave. He apologized so quickly and with such embarrassment that she couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't charming, exactly. But it was real. And Lillian, at 56, had no appetite left for performances. They had met 3 weeks earlier at the College of Charleston fundraiser, where Lillian had chaired the donor committee, and Walter, recently retired from a long tenure in commercial real estate, had arrived alone. He wore the uniform of his generation, navy blazer, tan slacks, a tie that looked expensive in a forgettable way. His handshake had been firm but not possessive, and when she'd mentioned her business, he didn't ask how she'd started it. He asked how she'd kept it alive for nearly 4 decades. No one ever asked her that. Their first few outings were cautious. Lunch at Puggin's porch. A walk along the Battery. He'd text a day in advance to confirm, always punctuating with a "looking forward." It was old-fashioned, and oddly comforting. Lillian was used to men who wanted to impress her or correct her, not ones who simply wanted to know her. "You scare the hell out of me," he confessed once, sitting beside her on a bench near Waterfront Park, shoes off, socks rolled into a neat ball between them. "Not in a bad way. In the kind of way where I wonder if I'll ever really catch up to the life you've already built." She looked at him carefully. "I'm not a ladder, Walter. You don't have to climb me. Just meet me where I am." He reached for her hand, and this time, he didn't fumble it. The first time he mentioned his children, they were walking through the Saturday farmers market on Marion Square. She was examining tomatoes when he said, almost absently, "Danielle would have loved this. She was obsessed with basil when she was little." Lillian nodded, expecting a story to follow, a funny anecdote, a lesson in parenting. Instead, there was a long silence. "She hasn't called in 7 years, he finally said. "Not since I remarried." Lillian didn't press. She knew better than to poke at wounds that weren't ready to be cleaned. But he offered it anyway. "My second wife, Sharon, she didn't get along with them. There were fights. Letters. I said things I regret. They stopped visiting. Then she died. Cancer, quick and cruel. I reached out after. Nothing." She glanced over, but he wasn't crying. He wasn't even tense. He just looked tired, the kind of tired that lives in the marrow of regret. "I'm not looking for sympathy," he added. "I just wanted you to know. You deserve to know." She appreciated that. Not because it painted him as the victim, she wasn't naive enough to assume he'd been blameless, but because he'd told her without framing it as a test. He hadn't begged for forgiveness, only understanding. That night, she cooked dinner at her house, roasted chicken, rosemary potatoes, and a salad he teased her for overdressing. He stayed to wash the dishes. Didn't offer. Just did it. She watched him from the hallway, dish towel slung over his shoulder, sleeves rolled to the elbows. She caught herself thinking, this is what peace looks like. Their relationship unfolded quietly. No ultimatums, no rings presented on stages, no Facebook announcements. After 11 months, he brought his toothbrush. After 15, he started sleeping over 3 nights a week. By the time he asked her to marry him, they were standing in her backyard after pulling weeds for hours, both of them sweating and dirt-smudged. "I don't want to live in separate houses anymore," he said simply. "I want to be with you, officially, permanently. I'm not trying to change your name or your mind. Just your mailing address." She didn't say yes right away. She asked him what he expected. About finances. About end-of-life plans. About what would happen if his children came back. He answered every question. Some awkwardly. Some with pause. But never defensively. So she said yes. They were married in a small garden ceremony with 12 people in attendance. No registry. No drama. Her dress was a deep green silk. His tie matched. His children were not invited. She had asked him if he wanted to try. He had written letters, mailed too. No response. Lillian never pushed further. She understood that not every story ended with reconciliation. Some ended with silence. And some, like theirs, began in the spaces that silence left behind. Back in the present, Lillian stood at the foot of her bed, folding laundry as the rain tapped against the windowpane. She had found the photograph earlier, tucked inside a drawer she rarely opened. It was from their first New Year's Eve together. She in a charcoal dress, he in a suit that didn't quite fit right. They were dancing in the corner of someone's living room, wine glasses forgotten on the windowsill. The photo was blurry. But their expressions were unmistakably clear. She traced the edge of the frame with one finger, then set it back in the The court battle was no longer about money, not really. It was about the stories people tell when they're afraid of being left with nothing. Jason and Danielle wanted to believe their father had been manipulated, tricked, taken. That he couldn't have chosen someone new without erasing them in the process, but Walter hadn't erased them. He'd mourned them quietly. Then chosen something else, chosen her. Lillian took a long breath, then turned off the light. In 3 days, they'd be back in court. And she would be ready, not because she needed to prove her love, but because she refused to let grief rewrite the truth. Jason Holbrook sat in the parking lot of his attorney's office, both hands gripping the steering wheel though the car was off. The engine had been silent for nearly 20 minutes, but his mind was spinning too fast to notice. The papers on the passenger seat, financial disclosures, discovery motions, bank statements, were like a second passenger, looming with the weight of everything he couldn't admit out loud. He didn't hate Lillian. That's what he told himself. Repeatedly. He just didn't trust her. She'd appeared so quickly, so confidently, in the twilight of his father's life. Too polished. Too calm. The kind of woman who took control of a room with quiet glances and clipped words. Jason had watched her at the funeral, dressed in gray, not black, composed, almost serene, as if she were closing a chapter, not grieving one. It infuriated him. He'd expected a different kind of widow. Someone devastated. Fragile. Not someone who barely acknowledged him. He grabbed the file from the seat and slammed the door shut, walking briskly toward the low-rise brick building. The lobby smelled faintly of copier toner and burnt coffee. Familiar. Comfortable, in the way offices were for people used to hiding behind procedures. Inside the conference room, his attorney, Harlan Keene, was already waiting. Sleeves rolled. Tie loosened, the posture of manufactured intimacy. She's not backing down, Keene said without looking up. Your father's name is on almost none of the property records. If we keep pushing the claim that these were joint marital acquisitions, we're going to need a different strategy. Jason dropped into the chair. You're the one who said we had a case. You do. Just not the one you thought. Keene flipped open a folder and slid it across the table. Your father drafted a new will 2 years ago. It leaves everything jointly held to her. The personal items, watch, cufflinks, even the antique rifle, are split between you and your sister. That's it. He didn't include the beach house because it was never in his name. Jason stared at the paper like it was written in another language. This isn't possible, he muttered. He loved that house. He didn't own it, Keene interrupted. She did. For 15 years. Jason's stomach twisted. Then why didn't he ever say anything? Keene leaned back. You sure that's the question you want to ask? Jason felt it again, the thing he tried not to name. The slow, creeping suspicion that his father hadn't told him the truth, not because he was being manipulated, but because he simply didn't want to. That was the thing no one said out loud. That maybe Walter Holbrook had made his choices freely. That maybe he hadn't been a victim. That maybe Jason had already lost his place long before Lillian appeared, and just didn't notice until it was too late. He thought of the last real conversation he'd had with his father, 8 years earlier. It had ended with Walter saying, "If you can't speak to me without bitterness, maybe we both need some time." Jason, full of self-righteous fury, had replied, "Take all the time you want." And Walter had. Later that night, Jason stood in the guest room of his suburban home in Mount Pleasant, sorting through a dusty plastic bin filled with old papers. He had come looking for the birthday card his father sent the year Danielle got married, the one with the clipped message and the $100 check. But instead, he found a letter. Unopened. Postmarked 5 years ago. It was addressed to him. Walter's handwriting, unmistakable. Jason sat down on the edge of the bed, hands trembling slightly, and opened it. Jason, I know we're not speaking. And I won't pretend I didn't play my part in how we got here. But I met someone. Her name is Lillian. She's not flashy, not young. She's stable. Smart. And for the first time in a long time, I feel less alone. I'm not asking for your approval. I just want you to know that this decision is mine. That I'm not being pushed. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. Always. Love, Dad. He read it twice. Then a third time. The shame settled slowly, like molasses, thick and undeniable. He hadn't seen it. Or maybe he had, and chose to ignore it. Chose to keep the narrative simpler, that Walter had been taken. Duped. Robbed of his senses. It was easier than confronting the truth, that his father had reached out, and Jason never reached back. He dropped the letter onto the bed, ran both hands through his hair, and sat there, frozen. His wife, Melanie, knocked lightly on the doorframe. Everything okay? He nodded, but couldn't speak. She stepped inside, her expression cautious. I know you think this is about the money, she said softly. But I think you're chasing something else. Jason swallowed hard. Like what? Redemption. He looked at her, startled. Jason, she continued, you spent years angry at your father. Maybe just ask yourself why. Before the court does it for you. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Back at her home, Lillian sipped a glass of wine and looked out over her backyard, unaware that miles away, Jason Holbrook was holding a letter he should have opened years ago. She had no idea that her calm demeanor was now stirring a deeper truth than any courtroom accusation, that the man they were all fighting over had already made peace with her. It was his son who hadn't. Lillian stood at the edge of her dining table, sleeves rolled to the elbows, a pen resting between her fingers like a scalpel. Before her, a sea of folders stretched across polished wood, color-coded, tabbed, and arranged by year, type, and relevance. There was no chaos here. Only order. Precision. Proof. I'm getting tired of proving I exist, she said softly. From the other side of the room, Cynthia glanced up from her laptop, eyebrows raised. You mean proving you existed before Walter? Lillian nodded. They keep acting like I appeared at his doorstep with a plan and a forged smile. You did appear with a plan, Cynthia said, her voice dry. Just not the kind they're accusing you of. Lillian allowed herself the faintest smile. The sun filtered in through the tall windows, casting long streaks across the hard floor. Outside, the wind shifted the branches of the old magnolia tree, the one Walter used to trim every spring, with grumbling stubbornness and a pair of shears older than God. Lillian had offered to hire someone. He insisted on doing it himself. Some things, he'd said, are only satisfying when you do them the long way. She missed him most in moments like this, not in grief-stricken waves, but in the little details. The lack of footsteps on hardwood. The absence of his mug beside hers. The silence where his commentary used to sit. Walter had been talkative during tension, a trait that once annoyed her, now sorely missed. He would have had something biting and brilliant to say about the Holbrook siblings filing for an emergency hearing. This hearing is a stunt, Cynthia said. They're trying to throw you off. Rattle you. It's working, Lillian admitted. But not the way they think. Cynthia looked up. I'm not afraid of what they'll say, Lillian continued. I'm just tired of being asked to justify a life I built without shortcuts. Cynthia paused, then crossed the room and pulled up a chair beside her. She glanced at the folders, the spreadsheets, the portfolio statements printed in clean black ink. Then she reached for the single envelope at the edge of the table, the one Lillian had been avoiding. The letters, she asked gently. Lillian hesitated, then nodded. They'd decided the night before that if the emergency hearing turned into a character trial, which it likely would, they'd need to submit some of Walter's private writings. Letters he'd written to his children but never sent. Letters filled with sorrow, regret, and ultimately, clarity. Do you want me to include them in the filing? Cynthia asked. Lillian looked down at her hands. They were steady, but she didn't feel steady. She felt like she was standing in the eye of a storm, calm, but aware the wind would soon return. Yes, she said. But I want to introduce them myself. Cynthia blinked. You mean read them aloud? If it comes to that, yes. Lillian, they need to hear him, she interrupted. Not just me. I've said everything I can say. But he wrote those words sober. Alone. With no lawyer, no witness, no agenda. If I let them stay sealed forever, it'll be like he never tried to reach them. Cynthia studied her carefully, then gave a slow nod. Okay. But if they get hostile, I'll step in. Lillian didn't reply. She knew they would. And she would. Let them. That evening, Lillian sat alone in her living room with the envelope in her lap. She hadn't opened it since Walter's death. It felt like trespassing, even now, but she slid out the first letter, dated 3 years ago, and began to read. Danielle, I don't know where to start. You've always been a wildfire, bright and angry and impossible to ignore. When you stopped speaking to me, I told myself I deserved it. Maybe I did. I never learned how to father you once you stopped needing things from me. But Lillian, she didn't take me from you. She just showed up when no one else would. I hope someday you'll understand that. Dad. Lillian's throat tightened. She remembered the day Walter wrote that one. He had sat in his reading chair for an hour after, unmoving. She thought he had fallen asleep. Instead, he was just sitting with the truth. She placed the letter back inside and reached for the second. Jason, if this letter ever reaches you, I hope it's not too late to say, I am not angry with you. I understand pride better than most. I wore it like armor for years, too. But I want you to know something simple. I was not coerced, misled, or tricked. I chose Lillian. And not because she made me feel young or needed or admired. She made me feel understood. You once asked why I stopped trying. I didn't. But I had to stop forcing. There's a difference. Dad. She folded it slowly, her hands colder now than before. It didn't matter if Jason ever accepted the truth. What mattered was that it existed. That Walter had made the effort. That someone, someday, maybe even a judge, would see it not as sentiment, but as testimony. As night settled over Charleston, Lillian prepared her bag for the hearing documents. ID notes, and the envelope. She paused at the doorway to Walter's study. His desk lamp still worked, still clicked with the same reluctant hum. She touched the back of his chair once, then turned out the light. Let them say what they will, she thought. Tomorrow, she would not raise her voice, she would raise his words. The courtroom was different this time. The room was smaller, tighter, no jury box, fewer seats. The kind of space designed for urgency rather than formality. Emergency hearings didn't require spectacle. Just facts. Or, at least, the appearance of them. Lillian sat at the respondent's table, calm in posture but vibrating inside with a tension she refused to let surface. Her gray suit was simple. Her hair pinned with surgical neatness. In her hands, a leather folder, and inside it, the envelope. Cynthia Morales leaned close. They brought exhibits, she murmured, nodding toward the other side. Jason and Danielle sat flanking their attorney like opposing bookends. Jason's suit was tighter than last time, maybe a size too small, maybe the result of poor sleep and worse meals. Danielle wore all black, again, as if mourning twice might strengthen the narrative. Judge Bernard Atkins entered from the side door without fanfare, looking already annoyed by the calendar shift. He didn't speak until he was seated. This is an emergency motion to delay the transfer of estate-held assets pending further investigation of spousal impropriety, he said, reading flatly from the docket. Counselor Keene, you're up. Harlan Keene rose. Your Honor, we believe new information has come to light regarding the timeline and financial motivations surrounding Ms. Stone's marriage to Walter Holbrook. We respectfully request a temporary injunction to prevent any property or liquid assets from changing hands until these concerns are reviewed. He handed the judge a folder. Inside are transaction records showing Walter Holbrook co-signed on a vehicle purchased during the marriage. While the title is in Ms. Stone's name, the financing trail suggests shared liability. We believe this sets a precedent for other potentially mischaracterized assets. Judge Atkins flipped briefly through the pages. That's a 2019 Lexus, he muttered. We're talking about a car? We're talking about a pattern, Your Honor, Keene said smoothly. One that warrants deeper scrutiny. Cynthia stood. Your Honor, Ms. Stone did purchase that vehicle. With her funds. The co-signature was a temporary measure while the dealership verified independent income. Payments were made exclusively from her account, and we've included those statements in our filing. Atkins nodded, then looked directly at Lillian. Do you dispute any of the facts regarding the car? No, Your Honor, she said evenly. But I do dispute the assumption behind the motion. And what's that? That my independence needs to be proven to someone else. There was a pause. Judge Atkins leaned back, folding his hands. What else do you have, Counselor Keene? Keene hesitated, just briefly. We believe Ms. Stone had undue influence over the deceased, and that a revised will executed in her favor may not reflect his uncoerced intentions. To that end, we object to the full execution of estate distributions until further psychological review of the decedent's final year. Cynthia stood immediately. Your Honor, unless the petitioners are presenting medical evidence of impairment or coercion, this claim is entirely speculative. Jason stood suddenly, startling everyone. I'd like to say something, he said. His lawyer half turned in alarm, but Jason had already moved forward. Judge Atkins blinked. Mr. Holbrook, you are not counsel, I understand, Jason said. But I'm also his son. There was a charged silence. Lillian didn't look away. Jason glanced at her, just once, and then back to the judge. My father and I didn't have the best relationship the last few years. That's true. And it's also true that I didn't understand why he married Lillian. It felt sudden, quiet, and honestly, I assumed the worst. He paused, swallowing. But last night, I found a letter, he said. From him? To me? From 5 years ago. The room shifted, eyes darted toward him. Jason exhaled. He said he wasn't coerced. That he chose her. That he wasn't being taken advantage of. A beat passed. Danielle looked like she'd been slapped. Jason's voice dropped. He wrote that she made him feel understood. And I didn't want to hear that. Not then. Maybe not even now. But I can't stand here and pretend he didn't say it. Keene looked stunned. Cynthia did not hide her surprise either. Judge Atkins raised an eyebrow. Do you have this letter with you? Jason nodded, walked back to his seat, and handed it to the bailiff. As the judge read in silence, the room took on the weighted hush of a moment no one quite knew how to stand, and Lillian didn't move. Her heart was pounding, not because she feared what would happen, but because something had shifted. Jason hadn't absolved her. But he'd told the truth. When the judge finished reading, he looked toward her. Miss Stone, is it true that the deceased wrote similar letters to his daughter? Yes, Your Honor, Lillian said. I have them here. She opened the envelope, pulled out the second letter, and handed it to Cynthia, who passed it along. Danielle stiffened but didn't object. She looked like she might cry, or scream. Maybe both. Judge Atkins read again, then sighed and closed the folder. I see no evidence of coercion, he said. No cognitive impairment. No financial foul play. The documentation presented by the respondent is clear. The decedent's intentions appear to be consistent with his legal arrangements. Emergency motion denied. He banged the gavel lightly. This hearing is concluded. As the courtroom stirred, Cynthia leaned toward Lillian. Did you know he kept the letter? She whispered. Lillian shook her head slowly, eyes fixed on Jason. He looked back once, then turned to leave. Danielle followed, her step stiff, face blank. Outside, the day was unusually warm for March. Lillian paused at the courthouse doors, letting the sunlight touch her skin. She didn't smile, but she did, quietly, close the envelope. They didn't speak until they were back in the parking garage. Jason unlocked the car without a word, the chirp of the remote echoing too loudly in the still, underground air. Danielle walked ahead, heels striking the concrete in clipped, furious taps. Her pace was faster than usual, not because she was in a rush, but because she didn't trust herself to speak slowly. Not today. When they reached the car, she turned to him abruptly. You embarrassed me in there, she snapped. Jason looked at her, tired. I told the truth. You don't even know if it's the truth. You found one letter and now she's a saint. She's not a saint, he said. But Dad wrote that letter 5 years ago. It was his handwriting, Danielle. His words. And? He also never sent it. That should tell you something. Jason hesitated. It tells me he tried. And maybe I just didn't want to hear it back then. Danielle threw up her hands. That's convenient. Jason leaned against the car. What do you want from me, Danny? We made this about her. About what she took. But what if she didn't take anything? What if he gave it? She glared at him. So that's it? We just let her walk away with everything. Jason's voice lowered. Everything that was already hers. The judge made that clear. Danielle turned away, hands pressed to her forehead. I can't believe you're doing this. He looked at her closely. No. You can't believe he did it. And you're blaming me because I finally stopped pretending he didn't. That stung. He saw it in the way her shoulders tensed. Danielle had always been their father's favorite. Or so it seemed. When they were kids, she was the one he carried on his shoulders, the one who could do no wrong, even when she did. Jason used to hate how easily she could charm her way back into forgiveness. But everything changed after Sharon. After the remarriage. After Danielle's furious letters went unanswered and her phone calls stopped altogether. He abandoned us, she whispered. Jason blinked. Or we walked away. She turned on him. Don't you dare. He replaced Mom with that woman. She took everything that was ours. No, he said, quietly. She filled a space he never asked us to occupy. Danielle stared at him, something wounded behind her eyes. Why are you defending her? I'm not, Jason said. I'm just tired of pretending we didn't make this mess too. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the letter again. He handed it to her, reluctantly. She looked down at it but didn't take it. I don't want his apologies, she said. Jason shrugged. I didn't either. Until I read it. They stood there a moment, suspended between grief and pride, the sharp echo of memory and the dull ache of adulthood. Danielle finally took the letter. Her fingers closed around it as if she was holding a hot coal. You know what I hate the most, she said, voice cracking. Jason didn't speak, that she never once tried to reach out to us. Not during the marriage. Not after. Not even now. Jason didn't argue. He didn't point out that maybe Lillian hadn't felt welcome. That maybe reaching out to the children who once called her a gold digger wasn't at the top of her list. He just said, maybe she thought he should be the one to fix it. Danielle shook her head, stepping away. You can forgive him if you want. I'm not there. He nodded. I wasn't either. Until yesterday. She walked toward the passenger side. So what now? We just drop it? Let her keep the house, the money, the beach property. Jason opened the driver's door. We stop fighting ghosts. Danielle didn't respond. She slid into the seat beside him and buckled her belt in silence. They drove through downtown Charleston without speaking, the silence broken only by the hum of tires and the occasional turn signal. Out the window, azaleas were blooming, bursts of pink against the city's old brick and iron. It was a beautiful afternoon for a funeral that never really ended. A red light, Jason finally said. He said she made him feel understood. Danielle stared out the window. I don't know if I ever did, she murmured. Jason didn't reply. Some truths didn't need defense, just space to settle. Back at her home, Lillian stood in her garden, trimming the edges of the rosemary bushes with Quiet purpose. The hearing was over. For now. But the wound it reopened would take longer to close. From the porch, Cynthia stepped out with 2 glasses of sweet tea. They won't appeal, she said. Keen's off the case. Jason told him to stand down. Lillian blinked in surprise. He what? He folded. Just like that. Lillian took the glass. Why? Cynthia looked at her, serious. Because sometimes, even grown children recognize when the story they've been telling themselves is too thin to survive the truth. Lillian said nothing, but in her heart, something softened, not victory, just relief. Danielle hadn't cried at the funeral. She'd told herself it was because she didn't need to, because Walter Holbrook had died years before the service in that church with its heavy doors and its suffocating lilies. The man in the casket wasn't her father. Not really. He was a version of him. Someone softened by time and reshaped by someone else's love, someone who had, in her mind, chosen a new life over his old one, over them. And now, 2 weeks after the emergency hearing, Danielle sat on the edge of the hotel bed she hadn't unpacked. The envelope from Jason resting unopened beside her. She hadn't read the letter yet. She'd carried it in her purse, moved it to her nightstand, now to her lap, but she couldn't bring herself to unfold it. Because once she did, the version of events she had clung to for years might fracture beyond repair. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jason, "Let me know when you're heading back. I'll meet you at the house." She didn't respond. She wasn't sure she was going back, not yet. Charleston made her feel dislocated, like a visitor in the house of a memory. It was a city of ghosts for her now. And none louder than the one who had written that letter. She finally picked it up. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her father's cursive, still too formal, still looping his LS and tailing his YS like he was writing to a bank, not his daughter. She unfolded the paper with slow hands. "Danielle, I'm not sure how to reach you anymore. Phone calls went unanswered. Letters came back. But I write anyway, because being silent has never helped either of us. I'm sorry. Not just for the marriage, though I know that's the wound you can't stop touching. I'm sorry I didn't understand how much it hurt you to watch me fall in love again after Sharon died. I didn't expect it, either. I didn't go looking for it. But Lillian is not your enemy. She never asked me to stop loving you. She just asked that I stop waiting for you to love me again. There's more I want to say. But maybe this is enough for now. If you ever want to talk, you know where I am." Danielle sat motionless for a long time. She read it again. And then again. And each time, the sentence that stayed with her wasn't the apology, it was, "She asked that I stop waiting for you to love me again." It gutted her, because it was true. She hadn't just walked away. She'd punished him for loving someone else. For not grieving long enough. For moving forward when she hadn't even figured out how to stand still. When her mother died, Danielle had made a decision without knowing it, to freeze time. To keep her family as it was in memory, perfectly framed, unchallenged. Her father was supposed to stay broken. Not rebuild. Not remarry. And certainly not without her blessing. She had offered silence instead of support. And he'd received her silence like a sentence, waiting for it to lift. It never did, until he stopped waiting. Her hand trembled slightly as she folded the letter again. There were no tears. Not yet. Just a kind of hollow quiet, like the moment after an earthquake when everything stands still but nothing is quite whole. She thought of Lillian, and for the first time, she didn't see a thief in a gray suit. She saw a woman who'd simply arrived late in the story. Who had loved quietly, stayed out of the way, and only now was being asked to account for things she hadn't broken. Danielle stood up slowly and walked to the small hotel window. Outside, the street buzzed with late afternoon activity, college students in sundresses, a couple with matching iced coffees, a man in a baseball cap unloading crates from the back of a delivery truck. She had spent the last 5 years angry. It hadn't brought her peace. It hadn't brought her father. It had only brought her here. Standing alone in a quiet hotel room with a letter that came too late but said what needed saying anyway. She picked up her phone. After a long pause, she typed, "Miss Stone, I read the letter. Thank you for keeping it. I think I'd like to talk." She hovered over the send button, then pressed it. Across town, Lillian sat on her porch, a book open in her lap, unread. The cat was curled beside her, purring lazily in the sun. When her phone buzzed, she picked it up with little thought. She read the message once, then again. No smile. No celebration, just a breath. Deep. Centered. She opened her calendar and made room. The cafe was quiet, not the trendy kind with industrial bulbs and loud playlists, but the kind that had existed long before Yelp reviews, where the staff knew your name, and the sugar packets came in a little ceramic bowl. Lillian chose a table near the window, her back straight, her bag tucked neatly beside her. She wore a soft navy blouse and her usual pearl earrings, not armor, not apology. Just herself. Danielle was 7 minutes late. When she finally walked in, she hesitated at the door, scanning the room until their eyes met. She didn't smile. Lillian didn't either. But both of them rose slightly, an unspoken gesture of civility. Danielle slid into the chair across from her, arms crossed reflexively before remembering and letting them fall. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. Lillian nodded once. "Of course." The server approached, and they both ordered coffee. No food. Neither one would eat. For a few moments, silence sat between them like a guest neither wanted to acknowledge. Then Danielle spoke. "I read both letters," she said. Her voice low. "Jason gave me his. I already had mine." Lillian folded her hands. "He meant for you to have them." Danielle nodded. Then looked down at the table. "He wanted us to understand." Lillian hesitated. "He didn't want you to choose between loving him and missing your mother. He just didn't know how to ask for space to do both." Danielle glanced up, eyes narrowing just slightly. "You think I made him choose?" Lillian met her gaze. Calm. Direct. "I think grief does strange things to people. I think everyone wants to claim their pain is the most valid. And I think sometimes we punish the people who survive the best." Danielle said nothing. The coffees arrived. They both reached for the cream and sugar at the same time, then paused, allowing the other to go first. It was a small thing. But it softened the air between them. "I hated you," Danielle said abruptly, eyes still on the coffee. Lillian didn't flinch. "I know. You showed up out of nowhere." And suddenly he was lighter. Like she never mattered. Like we didn't. Lillian stirred her drink once. He missed her every day. But missing her didn't mean he stopped living. Danielle's voice broke slightly. "We didn't know how to grieve him while he was still alive." Lillian finally spoke, more gently now. "And I didn't know how to step into a family that already saw me as a threat." Danielle looked at her again, really looked. The woman across from her was elegant, yes, but there were lines around her mouth, a weariness in her eyes that wasn't just about courtrooms or assets. It was the look of someone who had carried the weight of her own story for far too long without ever asking to be believed. "He really loved you," Danielle said quietly. Lillian nodded. "And I loved him. Not for what he gave me. But for who he became when he felt safe." Danielle sat with that. It hurt more than she expected. But it didn't feel like betrayal, not anymore. It felt like growing up. After a long pause, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small velvet pouch. She placed it gently on the table. "This was his," she said. "The pocket watch he wore on Sundays. Jason and we were going to keep it. But I think he'd want you to have it." Lillian didn't move at first. Then, slowly, she reached out and opened the pouch. The watch glinted softly, aged brass, the initials WH engraved on the back. She ran one finger over them. "He wore it when he first came to dinner at my house," she said softly. "Said it made him feel gentlemanly again." Danielle almost smiled. "Almost. I'm not here for peace," she said. "Not yet. But I don't want to keep holding on to a version of him that only hurts." Lillian nodded, closing the pouch. Gently. "That's a good start." They sat a while longer, neither in a hurry to leave. When Danielle finally rose, she didn't say goodbye. But she didn't leave angry, and Lillian didn't feel like she'd won anything, just that something had been laid down. A sword, maybe. Or a story too heavy to keep lifting. That evening, Lillian placed the pocket watch on the bookshelf in Walter's old study, beside his collection of Mark Twain novels and a photo of the two of them on their wedding day. She didn't cry. But she stood there a long while. Outside, the magnolia tree rustled in the breeze, and for the first time in months, the house didn't feel like a fortress under siege. It felt like home again. It had been 6 days since the last hearing. 3 since Danielle sat across from her with a letter and a pocket watch. And only 2 since Lillian realized she no longer needed to leave the porch light on at night, not for Walter, and not for the weight of being misunderstood. The house was quiet again. But not the tense, echoing quiet of grief or legal strategy. This was a new quiet, spacious, breathable. A hush that came not from loss, but from possibility. Lillian walked through the house barefoot, the way she used to before everything. Her steps fell softly on the hardwood floors, past the living room where Walter once read aloud from the newspaper just to hear himself sound important, past the kitchen where he insisted on making Saturday breakfast and always burned the bacon as she paused in the doorway of his study. The air still smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. She hadn't touched the desk since the funeral. Not really. But today, she opened the drawers, not looking for anything. Just making space. Inside, she found what she hadn't realized she was waiting for, a thin folder marked in Walter's handwriting. Just one word. Endings. She opened it slowly. Inside were clippings, handwritten lists, names of books, notes to himself. Estate documents, his own drafts, scribbled with revisions. One post-it note stuck awkwardly to the inside cover. "If it ever comes to this, give Lillian time, not pressure." She sat down. Walter had known what could happen, maybe not in detail, but in tension. He had anticipated the grief, the friction, the possibility that his children might lash out and that Lillian would be left to absorb the blow. And still, he had loved them. And still, he had chosen her, and that was a strange kind of grace. She placed the folder back in the drawer and exhaled slowly. No tears. She was long past tears. What she felt now was something closer to responsibility, for her own next chapter. Later that morning, Lillian drove to the beach house in Folly Beach. The drive took less than an hour, but it felt longer. Like crossing into a different life. The house sat low against the dunes, weather-worn but proud, its faded blue shutters sun-bleached and still standing strong. Walter had always joked that it looked like it had been through a divorce and come out wiser. Inside, it smelled like salt, driftwood, and time. She opened all the windows, letting the breeze in. The sound of waves rolled through the space, brushing against her shoulders like a familiar hand. There were still coffee mugs in the cupboard, towels folded too tightly, paperback novels stacked on a shelf with bent spines and dog-eared pages. Walter's sandals were still beside the back door. She didn't move them. Instead, she walked out onto the back deck and sat in the same wooden chair where he used to write letters he never mailed. For a moment, she closed her eyes, and then she began to speak, not out loud. Not dramatically. Just in her mind. I'm still here, Walter. But not the same. You taught me what it was like to be chosen without needing to be saved. And I think I'm finally ready to start again. Not to erase. But to continue. They're finding their way back to you, in their own way. You'd be proud of that. And as for me, I think I'm done being on defense. She opened her eyes. The ocean shimmered. That afternoon, Lillian called Cynthia and asked her to help start the paperwork to donate the Charleston rental property, the one she used to manage herself, to a local women's foundation. A space for transitional housing, she said. For women restarting their lives after divorce, loss, or worse. I want it to be something useful, she told Cynthia. Not a monument. Just momentum. Cynthia paused on the phone. That's going to make headlines. You sure you want to be visible right now? Lillian smiled faintly. Let them see me. And then, for the first time in weeks, she laughed. Not bitterly. Not politely. Just honestly. That evening, she sat at her desk, pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the drawer, and began to write. Not to Walter. Not to Jason or Danielle. To herself. Dear Lillian, you survived the accusations. You outlasted the storm. But what comes next is not survival, it's return. Not to who you were before, but to who you are now. So take your time. But don't stay still. You've already proven enough. Now it's time to live like you believe it. She signed the letter, folded it, and slipped it into the drawer beside Walter's folder marked endings. Then she labeled hers beginnings. Jason didn't tell anyone he was going. He took the long way, out of habit, maybe. Over the bridge with its wide arches, past marshes thick with morning fog. Folly Beach had always felt like the edge of something, not just of land, but of story. His father's story had ended here. And for the first time, Jason wasn't arriving to argue about who it belonged to. The house looked smaller than he remembered. The paint more faded. The storm shutters slightly crooked, like the place had exhaled and never quite pulled itself together again. Still, it stood, wind-battered but unbowed. Just like Walter, Jason unlocked the door with the spare key Cynthia had mailed him and stepped inside. The scent hit him first, ocean air, old wood, and something faintly citrus, the smell of his father's aftershave, maybe, lingering in corners. No one cleaned too often. For a second, Jason just stood there. He hadn't expected the silence to feel so personal. There were still books on the shelf. Framed photographs on the side table. The kitchen radio, the one Walter had duct-taped after Danielle dropped it in a sink, sat proudly on the counter, but it was the chair that undid him, that damn wooden chair on the back deck, where Walter had read novels, sipped coffee, and once given Jason the only heartfelt compliment he could remember. You're more like me than you think. That's why we clash. He'd hated that at the time. Now, he wasn't so sure. Jason stepped outside and lowered himself into the seat. It creaked under his weight, but held, solid, unflinching. He looked out at the water and tried to imagine what his father had seen when he sat here. Not just waves or tides, but quiet. A life earned. A final chapter written in full sentences, not regrets. He took a breath, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something he hadn't told anyone he kept, Walter's favorite pen. A cheap rollerball with a brass clip, the kind you could buy in bulk but that Walter treated like it was handcrafted in Switzerland. Jason turned it over in his fingers. I didn't come for an apology, he said softly. I think I came for a witness. There was no answer, of course. Just the wind, lifting faintly. I wasn't ready to lose you. But I'd already lost the version of you I wanted to believe in. And I think you knew that. He paused. I hated that you let her in. That you were happy with someone who wasn't mom. But I think, deep down, I knew it wasn't about betrayal. It was about moving forward when I couldn't. The ocean responded only with rhythm. No wisdom. Just movement. Jason leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You know what's hard? Knowing you tried. That letter, it wrecked me. Not because of what it said, but because you'd already made peace. You were waiting for me to catch up. He stared out at the horizon. I'm catching up. Inside the house, he wandered without touching much. A man doesn't root through another man's life unless he plans to carry the weight of what he finds, but there was one thing he couldn't ignore, a binder on the kitchen counter labeled simply Lillian, Estate Instructions, in Walter's handwriting. The pages inside were meticulous, typed inventories, property documents, letters of intent. Nothing hidden. No surprises. Jason flipped to the last page. There was a postscript. Typed. But it read like his father had spoken it aloud. Before writing, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're still angry. I hope that's changed. But if not, let me offer one final truth. I chose her because she saw the parts of me I kept buried under pride. And she loved them anyway. Don't waste your life trying to rewrite mine. Write your own. And for God's sake, stop thinking this. House is your inheritance. It's not. Your inheritance is time. Use it better than I did. Jason closed the binder. This wasn't defeat. It was instruction. That evening, he sat on the beach, toes in the sand, pants rolled up like he was 10 again. No phone. No case to argue. No agenda, just stillness. He picked up a shell and ran his thumb across its ridged back. The sun was slipping low, painting the sky with that kind of pink-orange that photographers chase and poets oversimplify. Jason didn't speak again. He just sat there, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he had to defend who he was to a man who was no longer there. He just missed him, and somehow, that felt like enough. The invitation came on a Thursday. It wasn't a handwritten note or a dramatic email, just a quiet, respectful message from the Charleston Women's Foundation. They were launching the transitional housing program she'd helped fund, and they wanted her to attend the opening. Not as a sponsor. Not as a headline. Asa story. We'd like you to say a few words, the coordinator had written. About why you chose to give. Lillian closed her laptop and stared out the window for a long time after reading it. She wasn't sure if she had an answer anyone wanted to hear. Or maybe she wasn't sure if she owed one anymore, but still, she RSVP'd yes. The house looked different now, not physically. It was still brick and cedar, still wrapped in jasmine vines that bloomed too early every spring. But inside, it breathed easier. She had donated half the furniture. Kept only the pieces she used. Let go of Walter's ties. Kept his letters. Turned the guest room into a reading space. Planted rosemary in the back where the old grill used to sit. For once, it felt like a house that didn't need defending. She walked through it now in bare feet, carrying a folder of prepared remarks she might not use. The cat trailed behind her, as if sensing something was shifting. Not an ending. A departure. At the front door, she paused, looking at the framed photograph she had recently moved, Walter and her, wedding day, sunlit, shoulders touching. It now hung in the hallway, not center stage, not hidden either. Just present. She touched the frame once with her fingertips, then opened the door and stepped out into the soft Charleston morning. The event was small by design. A few donors. Some city officials. 2 local journalists. And a dozen women who would soon live in the building, a restored duplex she'd once bought as a rental, now repurposed with new paint, new beds, and new intentions. The air buzzed with a gentle kind of hope. No champagne flutes. No velvet ropes. Just people talking in the shade of a live oak. When they called her name, Lillian stepped onto the makeshift platform, a few boards and a mic stand, and looked out at the gathered crowd. She didn't unfold her paper. She didn't need to. I was asked to speak about why I gave this property, she began, voice even. And for a while, I struggled with how to answer that. A pause. The quiet kind of attention that leans in. I could say it's because I know what it means to start over. Because I do. I could say it's because I believe women deserve stability while they rebuild their lives. That's also true. A breeze moved gently through the trees, but really, I gave this house because I'm finally done proving what I'm worth. She let that sit. I spent the last year defending a life I'd already lived. A marriage I'd already earned. A legacy I'd already built. And when it was over, I realized, what I want now is to build forward. Not fight backward. She looked down for a moment, then back up. This home is not a monument to loss. It's not an apology. It's momentum. For every woman who needs to remember that dignity doesn't come from what we're given. It comes from what we claim. Quietly. Fiercely. For ourselves. No applause followed at first. Just stillness, then one clap. Then more. She nodded once and stepped down. After the event, a woman in her 40s approached her. She wore work boots, paint on her hands, and a guarded look in her eyes. You donated this place? She asked. Lillian nodded. The woman looked around. I used to think people like you had no idea what people like us went through. Lillian smiled gently. That's a fair assumption. The woman looked at her, eyes narrowing. Then softening, well, maybe not all people like you, she muttered. Thanks for this. She extended a paint-stained hand. Lillian shook it. I hope you find peace here, Lillian said. The woman hesitated. I hope I find me. Lillian nodded. That's the better thing to look for. That evening, Lillian walked along the Battery, the sky above her streaked with the last amber remnants of the sun. She didn't walk with purpose, or memory, or nostalgia. She simply walked. Her phone buzzed out a message from Jason. Thank you for everything. I hope we talk again sometime. She replied, me too. No need for more. Not yet, maybe not ever, but the door was open. Back home, she poured a glass of wine, turned off the porch light for the first time in months, and stood by the window. She was no longer the woman in the courtroom. No longer the one questioned. No longer the one underestimated. She was Lillian Stone, retired. Respected. Free, not because she'd won, but because she'd stayed true, and sometimes, the most powerful woman in the room is the one who doesn't need to prove anything at all.